Doris Starks was born in Conecuh County, Alabama in 1937. At a very young age, she was exposed to the very blatant racism and injustices that were commonplace during this time. There were no mixing of the races in a social or business fashion. There were separate drinking fountains and bathrooms. African Americans could not get accommodations in hotels, and they were required to ride in the back of buses and trains. While both Mrs. Starks' mother and father had large land holdings in their respective families, which gave them independence and allowed them to escape some of the burdens of racism, they were not at all resistant to the level of inequality and discrimination that existed.
Growing up in Alabama in the 1940s was a challenging experience. I was fortunate enough to grow up in a family that did have land assets, and as black families go, it was in some ways quite privileged. At around 1946, when my father had returned from World War II, we were making adjustments, and we moved to an adjoining community, that of Andalusia, Alabama. My father was making plans for all of us, he and my mom, and he needed a good job, but he couldn't find one. Although he had been a highly skilled technician in World War II, he couldn't find a job with the telephone company. When he came back to Andalusia, Alabama, because of discrimination in hiring practices, all he was permitted to do was stand at the bottom of the telephone line and hand tools to a Caucasian person who then went up the poles to make the repairs. And there was a great difference in salary for those two positions.
In 1948, Mrs. Starks and her family moved from Conecuh County to Tuskegee, Alabama, in order for her father to find a decent job and to be able to send her to college at Tuskegee Institute. Later on, while Mrs. Starks was still in college, she participated in voting clinics in an effort to get more blacks on the voting rolls in Macon County. She testified in court on the injustices of the voting system during that time and was instrumental in forming the legal basis for the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
In my senior year, I became involved with attendance at a voting rights clinic that was sponsored by the Tuskegee Civic Association. It was well known that blacks in the county outnumbered the whites in Macon County, but the voting didn't always go the way you would think it would go, because the registrars hindered blacks from voting. I also appeared before the U.S. Civil Rights Commission that was investigating voting rights in Alabama. I was one of the plaintiffs. And then when we were there, and it was time for others who had been registered by the registrar to testify, we found that truly many of them were not literate, that they could not recognize or even sign their own names, that the registrars had signed the forms for them, that those persons had put an X on the signature line. So those were some of the inequities. And so our case went to court. It went up the line in the district court and the court system, and it eventually went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And my voter registration was granted by order of the U.S. Supreme Court. And that's how I got to vote.
Today, even though Mrs. Starks is retired, she still continues to be an active leader in her community and beyond as a mentor and advocate for social justice. Her latest endeavor is a book on the life and death of John Brown, titled The Last Days of John Brown, the Abolitionist.
This past week, I participated with the Volunteers of America, Chesapeake, and the Carolinas in a Zoom meeting that focused on healing conversations. And in that meeting, we talked about systemic racism. I've also talked with students at Tuskegee University, and I've also written a book about the last days of John Brown. I think John Brown deserves another look. And you can buy this book on Amazon or Books A Million or Barnes and Noble, and see what you think in light of today's movements that all lives matter, Black lives matter. In other words, Black lives don't matter any more than any other lives, but they want to be counted as well. They want to be counted more than 3/5 of a person. And if that is done, there will be no gerrymandering, no stealing of votes, no hiding of mailboxes so that some votes don't get to be counted. In other words, we are more than 3/5 of a person.